This is the story of your enslavement, how it came to be, and how you can finally be free. Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them. At first, we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical and terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death and of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable and so valuable in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human beings. You can frighten an animal because animals are afraid of pain in the moment, but you cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty, with torture or imprisonment in the future, because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat. You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him. This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax. Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is: a series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields, and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into? There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion. Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip and the brand and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control. The second phase was the Roman model, wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity, and creativity, which raised their productivity. This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government, and with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power, and collapsed. I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar. After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation. Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords. This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated and hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people. The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities, which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership. As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations. Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model. The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners. You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay to your masters.
Value this time in your life, kids, because this is the time in your life when you still have your choices. And it goes by so fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. 30s, you raise your family, you make a little money, and you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin. The music starts to get too loud. One of your old girlfriends from high school becomes a grandmother. 50s, you have a minor surgery. You'll call it a procedure, but it's a surgery. 60s, you'll have a major surgery. The music is still loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear it anyway. 70s, you and the wife retire to Fort Lauderdale. Start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10, breakfast the night before. Spend most of your time wandering around malls looking for the ultimate soft yogurt and muttering, how come the kids don't call? How come the kids don't call? The 80s, you'll have a major stroke. You end up battling with some Jamaican nurse your wife can't stand, but who you call mama. Any questions?
Your few freedoms are preserved because they are profitable to your owners. The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers. The ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labor, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all. Ah well, nobody ever said that human farming was easy. Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a three-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education. As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock. It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea. Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
Officers positioned Grant face first on the floor with one officer near his head, a second near his back, and a third officer standing nearby. There appeared to be a brief struggle. Then, a 2-year veteran BART officer stands, draws his weapon, and fires.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If you can get the cows to attack each other, whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly. Those cows who become dependent upon the stolen largesse of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership. And the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, "You will harm your fellow cows." The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of the violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent continual external threats so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end. The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms. The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed the size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms. In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest. This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership, without the violence of taxation and statism. To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.
In the course of human evolution, societies have used countless different things as money. Is it possible that what a society chooses as its money can affect the behavior of its people?
The classical, conventional way of thinking about money is that it's a passive medium of exchange that is being used as a convenience to make exchanges between people, and that it doesn't really affect either the kind of transactions that are being performed, it just makes them easier, or the relationships between the people that are using that kind of money. Both these things happen to be proven wrong.
Different kinds of money do have very different properties, and one of the key properties is the level of abundance or scarcity of the item that's being used as money. If it's abundant, you will get a proliferation of trade. People will be able to exchange their goods and services fairly freely. If money is scarce, you create a very serious problem because you prevent people from actually being able to exchange goods and services.
Most people have no idea where money comes from. A lot of people believe that it's the governments that create the money.
Conventional money is not created by the government, as many people believe, and is not even created by the central banks. Although they do part of it. But it is actually created by the banking system.
People see these films about the U.S. Mint and the government printing office, and they see these sheets of dollar bills being run off the printing presses. And so they think it's the government that's printing money. But this is not the real source of money. The real source of money is banks.
The banks have a complete monopoly on the money creation process. So the public are not actually involved in it at all, directly or indirectly.
The Federal Reserve is a private institution owned by commercial banks who are members of the Federal Reserve System, which includes all the nationally chartered banks.
Most people don't realize that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation and is for profit. And in fact, Federal Reserve, it's neither federal and it's not a reserve.
In 1910, a group of top American bankers met on Georgia's Jekyll Island to discuss ways of stabilizing the country's banking system. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, giving this private corporation a monopoly over issuing the nation's money supply. How then did the power to issue something as fundamental as money fall into private hands?
Initially, you can think a bank was about storing people's gold. So you come in, you store your gold at the bank, and the banker gives you a gold certificate and says, you have such and such amount of gold in my bank. Now, the basis of the paper money systems was when you could start trading those pieces of paper.
Let's say you have some gold that you want to keep safe. You put it in a bank, and the bank gives you a paper receipt you can redeem later for your gold. You can now trade that piece of paper in place of the gold, as long as others are also able to redeem it for your gold. The good name of the bank on the paper note assures people that behind the piece of paper is a piece of gold waiting to be redeemed. Soon, as the people's confidence in the bank grows, rather than cashing in the receipt, the person receiving the paper simply trades it again. The paper may end up being traded many times before being redeemed for the original gold in the bank.
And banks discovered that when people started paying each other with claims to the coins in the bank's vault rather than taking the coins out, that the bank didn't really need to keep all the coins in the vault in order to have enough to actually pay people who did come and want coins.
The banker realizes nobody's coming to take the gold. Gold's just sitting there. So instead of just putting out one piece of paper that says, you know, there's such and such amount of gold, you can put out a lot of pieces of paper given the fact that nobody is coming and taking the gold. And you can lend money. And the basis of that loan is the trust that people have that if they want to come and get the gold will be there. The only thing that makes that system work is the fact that nobody actually does come to get the gold. Now, if everybody said, you know what, I'm going to go get my gold at the bank. If everybody went and got it, there wouldn't be enough gold for everybody.
You often had bank runs and bank panics. When people would have a lack of confidence in a particular bank, they would take those bank notes to the bank and demand their gold and silver. And with fractional reserves, that bank would quickly run out of the reserve metal and have to close its doors.
The reason the bank did it is because they were making money off of earning interest, off of those loans that were promises that there was gold in the bank.
As people's confidence in the bank and its receipts continues to grow, banks soon discover an unexpected way to earn profit. A bank can print a receipt for gold that does not even exist. They can then loan that receipt to someone on the condition that they pay it back with interest. While the bank takes a risk by having less gold than the outstanding receipts, there is an almost unlimited potential to make profit off charging interest on loaning gold it does not even have. If people catch on that there isn't enough gold to redeem their receipts, they will all go to the bank at once to get their gold. If this happens, there will be a bank run. The bank will fail because it is caught without enough gold to back up its receipts. In 1934, in an attempt to prevent further bank failures, a series of banking reforms slowly took away people's ability to trade their paper money in for gold or silver. In 1971, Richard Nixon removed the last vestiges of this convertibility. Today, our money can no longer be redeemed for gold or silver.
Now we've gone beyond that to what I think of as an even more postmodern reality, which is We don't even see the money anymore. We don't hold it in our hands. We take a piece of plastic to the supermarket, buy groceries, and run it through a machine which registers it in our account book somewhere. The seller doesn't see it either, right? And at the end of the day, they balance accounts, and some numbers have been added to the supermarkets and taken out of ours account.
Most of the assets that we call money are not printed dollar bills. In fact, that currency is a very small proportion of the total amount of money. Most of what we call money are bank accounts.
In the same way that banks used to issue more paper money than they had gold, today banks issue more bank account money than they have cash reserves. It is these bank account balances that make up about 97% of what we think of as money. If a landlord wants to know how much money you have before you sign a lease, you would show them an account balance and not a suitcase full of cash.
Another misconception that people have about money is that money is a thing. But in today's world, money is simply credit, which means it's an information system. And the question is, what kind of information does it convey? It's information about claims against the economic output.
So if money is nothing more than information about what we owe each other, how does the money we use every day get created?
Money is created through a process of bank loans. People, companies, governments going to the banking system and borrowing money. So every dollar, every national currency you've ever seen is someone's debt.
For every new dollar created in the monetary system, you have a corresponding debt. That works both for the Federal Reserve dollars themselves and for the bank deposit dollars that are based on them.
Money is issued whenever someone takes out a loan from the bank. So if I walk into a bank and I want to borrow $500,000 to start a business, and I've got a good business plan and I've got customers, then the bank, assuming they agree, will give me $500,000 to start my business. Now most people, if you ask them, will say, well, that $500,000 comes from somewhere else. It comes from someone else's savings. It comes from investments. That's actually not true. When I say money is issued as debt, I mean they don't get that money from anywhere. They actually create it out of thin air and create a credit in my bank account, and poof, there it is.
John Kenneth Galbraith, in his book Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went, says this. He says, "The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled." And it's true. When I tell people how money is created by banks, simply by making ledger entries, they just can't believe it.
The private banking system literally creates our money out of nothing and loads it into the economy. The only way new money can get into the economy and ultimately your pocket is via a bank loan. This means that every dollar you have ever seen is someone's debt to a bank.
The simple fact is, and it's an uncomfortable fact for many people to realize, that if all the debts were repaid, then all the money supply would simply disappear. There would be no money. And that would mean a complete and total collapse of the economy. The catch is that they want more repaid than what they've given me.
When you go to a bank and borrow $100,000 to buy a house, they will check whether you are a good credit, and then they will decide to create the money, entering it electronically in your account, and say you have to bring back $200,000 in the next 20 years. The $100,000 of the first loan is created. The second one, the interest rate, is not created. So they send you in the world, compete with everybody else to bring in the second $100,000. That's how the money is kept scarce. It is through the competition between the different players for interest that is not created. So there's always less money than is necessary. okay? And it's done systemically.
If you go to a bank and you borrow money into circulation, if the bank decides to approve your loan application, they will make two entries on their books. One is they will take your note, let's say it's a mortgage note, and that will be an asset on the books of the bank, and they will offset that with an equal deposit to your account, which is a liability on the books of the bank. So the money creation process is as simple as that. But the bank does not create the interest that you're going to have to pay year by year by year until this mortgage loan matures. So where does that interest come from?
Where does the interest come from? I have to find that.
Well, it has to come from some other loan that was made to someone else. So you have this inherent deficiency in the money supply. Not everyone can repay what they owe to the banks. At any given time, there is more owed to the banks than exists in circulation.
Which means, inevitably, someone is going to lose the game. Someone is going to go bankrupt, and that has nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of the goods and services or the efficiency of the business. Nothing at all.
It's like a game of musical chairs. It assures that there must be some losers, regardless of how competent they are in conducting their business.
The money we get when we receive a loan is called principal. Our debt, however, is not discharged when we repay the principal. Bank loans are all made on the condition that people pay both the principal and the interest the bank charges. However, money can only be issued as principal. No one creates the interest, so the amount of debt owed is actually far greater than the amount of money there is to repay it. When a dollar is loaned into the economy, it begins a loop. Joe the farmer gets a loan from the bank and pays Tom for fixing his tractor. Tom pays Jane for bread at the local bakery, and Jane in turn buys the wheat from Joe, who can now repay the loan. The problem is, Joe owes the bank interest on top of the principal. In order to avoid losing his property to the bank, Joe must go find other money making its own loop in the economy. He can now repay his loan with the interest, but the people in that loop are left without their money. They still need money to facilitate their exchanges and to repay the loan that issued the money they had been using. The only place they can get it is from other such debt loops. Since all money has an interest price tag attached, there will never be enough money to repay all the debt owed to banks. Therefore, some people will always have to go bankrupt or have their property repossessed by the bank.
And it is the fear of losing assets coupled with the struggle to keep up with the perpetual debt and inflation inherent in the system, compounded by the inescapable scarcity within the money supply itself, created by the interest that can never be repaid, that keeps the wage slave in line, running on the hamster wheel with millions of others, in effect powering an empire that truly benefits only the elite at the top of the pyramid. For, at the end of the day, who are you really working for? The banks. Money is created in a bank and invariably ends up in a bank. They are the true masters, along with the corporations and governments they support. Physical slavery requires people to be housed and fed. Economic slavery requires people to feed and house themselves. It is one of the most ingenious scams for social manipulation ever created, and at its core, it is an invisible war against the population. Debt is the weapon used to conquer and enslave societies, and interest is its prime ammunition.
Of slavery. It didn't end in the 1860s. It's a social malady that's with us today, and it's increasing in its scope and virulence. The desire to enslave our fellow man is unfortunately intrinsic to the human character. It has been with us since the beginning of time, on every continent and in virtually every culture, from ancient Egypt to Babylon to Greece and Rome, Africa, Asia, Europe, and the United States. Germany and Japan openly practiced widespread slavery only 50 years ago, and the Soviet Union until less than a decade ago. China even today. It's a disease of our human nature, and yet people are under the impression that it no longer exists. I say to you that in a subtle form, it exists in America today, and it's becoming less subtle and more manifest. Madison Avenue has just cleaned it up a little bit, dressed it up in new words. The slave master is now Big Brother, someone to protect you, someone to confide in. But it's all the same. He owns your life. This may sound far-fetched, but I think I can prove it. When the IRS allows you a tax deduction, they and their congressional collaborators and the media call it a tax subsidy. In other words, they designate it as a gift to you, a subsidy. The only way they could conceive this terminology is by presupposing that they, i.e. the government, own all the money. Their view is that they're entitled to it all. That which they allow you to keep is their compassionate and generous gift to you. How can this be? You create the money by your efforts, your sacrifice, your creativity, your risk-taking. So how can it belong to them? It's very simple. They own you. They own everything you produce, your money, your house, your thoughts and ideas, your children. If you go to a foreign country to work, you still have to pay the U.S. income tax. You could dig a hole in the middle of Siberia and they'd be entitled to a cut of your wages because in their minds, under their law, they own you. They create arcane and esoteric laws to criminalize you. You may try, but you can't obey them. You can't even understand them without a lot of professional help.
Now to talk about some of the other fascinating new laws of 2014 is legendary attorney and Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz. We're catching him in Miami. He's also author of the new book, Taking the Stand. Professor Dershowitz, thanks for joining us. It's clear we're in a whole new world when laws about drones are making it into the books.
Well, happy 2014, everyone. January 1st brings with it not only a new year, but also new laws that come into effect. The moment the ball dropped in Times Square, some 40,000 new local, state, and federal laws kicked in across the country. Here's a look at some of the interesting ones that we found. Now, in Delaware, residents can no longer possess, sell, or distribute shark fins inside state lines.
Well, it's a bill that has received very little attention, but may make free speech a felony and seriously restrict your right to political protest. Just signed into law by the president, H.R. 347 gives federal agents sweeping powers to arrest and bring felony charges against citizens engaged in protests where the Secret Service is present.
Neither David Koresh nor Randy Weaver, whatever things might be said about them, had ever mugged anyone, robbed a 7-Eleven, or committed forcible rape or murder. But they did have unorthodox views, and therefore it was necessary to round them up and deal with them. Whatever their crimes were, they could have been arrested and tried openly in a court of law. But that was not the aim of certain factions in the government. These statists wanted a massive demonstration of force to show who was boss. The penalty for resisting is death. After all, we're not free. We belong to the government, and deviant thoughts will not be tolerated. In the aftermath of the horrible Oklahoma City bombing, government propagandists tried to intimidate the people into silence by recklessly linking criticism of the government to acts of murder. Some people ask, how can you fear your government and claim to love your country? Our response is, how can you love your country without fearing your government? Who else holds a counterfeit license to kill, incarcerate, and confiscate for non-crimes? Remember, America is about liberty first and last, not obedience to bureaucrats. The Washington power clique wants you to shut up, get in line, do what you're told to do, and most outrageously, think what you've been told to think. We have hundreds of politicians and thousands of lobbyists crawling all over Washington, thinking of ways to control you, to extend their will over you, to subvert your freedom and replace it with their will, to capture, that is, to steal your life force. And so we should all be very angry, because anger is the engine that drives our will to resist. And without resistance, without awareness, they will take it all. That's not just politically perverse, it's a sin against mankind, because freedom is actually sacred. Drop an ant into a jar and seal the lid. It will spend the rest of its life trying to get out. It has nowhere to go, but it wants to be free. That is its nature. It's the way every living thing is made. Once, a long time ago, I saw something at the zoo, a wolf lying in its cage. I thought about how this magnificent animal was the end product of millions of years of evolutionary design. A nose that could detect the faintest scent, ultrasonic hearing, eyes that could see in the dark, teeth and jaws capable of crushing thick bone, heart and lungs that could run him for hours in a sub-zero blizzard. And yet there he was, lying forlorn and full of despair. He was well fed. He had a clean habitat and water and medical care. So what was the problem? He was sick with the knowledge that his wonderful powers would never be exercised again. And so he lay there, his head on his paws, staring blankly ahead at perhaps some imaginary forest that he could never reach because there were bars around him. They had not killed his body, but they were destroying his soul. God gave Adam and Eve freedom, even though he knew they would invite death into the world. That's how important freedom is in the divine scheme of things, and that's why we urge you to defend it.